Yes. Well, let's give a huge welcome to Alan Jackson.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Tim. I am so pleased to be here. I've been looking forward to this for months. About a month ago, well, exactly a month ago today, I went to the Royal International Air Tattoo at Fairford in Gloucestershire. And I went with my very good friend, Chris. And it's a big event in the UK aviation calendar. All sorts of military aircraft are there, which is my personal favourite. And I'd not been there for 30 years since I last went with my wife. And I looked up at the sky and I saw some of the aircraft do things I'd never seen them do 30 years ago. And I then remembered why it is that I've been rarely fascinated by anything more than I'm fascinated by aeroplanes. I've got a hell of a story for you tonight, and it's about a particular act of heroism by a particular individual, a pilot in the Royal Air Force in World War II, involving that aeroplane. Lost and found, the mystery of the Norwegian Spitfire, which is a mystery we shall solve this evening. First of all, before I do this, just want to give you a quick bit of background about the Spitfire. That is R.J. Mitchell. R.J. Mitchell designed the Supermarine Spitfire from scratch. Some 10 years earlier, he created this aircraft, which some of you might recognise as being a Supermarine S2B, which won the Schneider Trophy for Great Britain 3 years in a row in 1929, 30 and 31. It was that aircraft that RJ was thinking about when he developed the Spitfire. This is Geoffrey Quill. Geoffrey Quill and his team was the primary test pilot for the early experimental prototype versions of the aircraft. It was Geoffrey's job to be the bridge between an aeroplane on paper and an aeroplane that would actually fulfill its role. Finally, Alex Henshaw. Now, 23,000 Spitfires were made in total. Each one of those had to be tested after it had come away from the factory and before being delivered to the squadrons. And it was Alex and his team who flew the 30,000 odd missions in order to make sure each aircraft was safe for pilots to fly. And it said that Alex personally flew 1 in 10 of those. There is no man, has not ever been any man who's put more hours in a Spitfire cockpit than Alex. So I think it's fair to say that these men were responsible for bringing the Spitfire into World War II and into aviation history as a truly iconic military aeroplane. The first prototype of the Spitfire flew in the spring of '36. The first production model not for another 2 years and 2 months. The reason for that gap is another whole talk altogether. But if you want to ask me a question at the end of this, I'll try and praise it. But look at the similarity between R.J. Mitchell's initial 1926 creation and the Spitfire. Low wing monoplane, straight line from front to back, the whole bit. That's what he was thinking about. And apparently, at the time, the chairman of Supermarine was a chap called Robert McLean. He had a daughter, aged 6, who he used to fondly refer to as his little Spitfire. Thus, the aircraft got its name. And apparently R.J. Mitchell wasn't all that impressed by that, just the sort of bloody silly name they would choose. But I only read recently that he was going to call it, or would, if asked, he would have called it the Shrew, which I don't think has quite the punch. But anyway, what do I know? So, Supermarine Spitfire. There it is, a couple of pictures. Average cost to build in those days, £12,600, which today equates to about £650,000. Men pilots in fighter command and also women of the Air Transport Auxiliary loved flying this aeroplane. It had an incredible rate of turn, an incredible rate of ascent, and a great over-the-ground speed. They all also said that it felt as if they just had to think of a movement to make in the cockpit and the Spitfire would obey them. But for me, the greatest quote was by the very highly decorated German Messerschmitt pilot, a chap called Adolf Gelland. He said that if he and his squadron were bounced on by a squadron of Hurricanes, that was going to be another day in the office. If he was bounced on by a squadron of Spitfires, he wouldn't know whether he was going to make it home safely that day. So, just one final bit of information. The first Spitfire squadron was delivered plane by Geoffrey Quill to number 19 at Duxford. Hitherto, this is the aircraft that they were flying. It's a Gloucester Gauntlet, and it looks pretty antique-y, but it was state-of-the-art at the time. Can you imagine what it must have been like to be a pilot when Geoffrey Quill rocks up with one of these little babies? And it's just, nothing will ever be the same since that design actually hit the tarmac. All of a sudden, we've got an enclosed cockpit, we've got undercarriage that folds up inside the wings. A beautiful aeroplane, beautiful to fly by all accounts. So let me get back to my story, the mystery of the Norwegian Spitfire. Now, one of the reasons that the Spitfire was so successful was its ability to be modified. One such modification was known as the Photo Reconnaissance Unit version. Its job was to fly at very high altitude, typically 36 to 40,000 feet, go over enemy territory, take lots of photographs, and come the hell back as quick as possible, where the photographs can be developed and inform a bomber command strategy. Now, this particular Spitfire was very highly modified for long range. What do I mean? Well, typically a Spitfire would be able to fly about 350, 400 miles on a full set of tanks. The PRU Spitfire needed to be able to fly anywhere between 1,400 and 2,000 miles. So there had to be a lot of weight accommodations. And therefore, a PRU Spitfire was not armed, had all unnecessary armour removed from the cockpit, and also had to be made very light for these bad boys. Now each of those, and what that chap's carrying on his shoulder, is an f8 20-inch lens photo reconnaissance camera. Each one weighed about the size of a middle-sized dog, about 16, 17 kilograms, and two of those were mounted on either side of the fuselage behind the pilot. Okay, so let's get into the mission of my particular story. There was a problem, and it's this thing here. That is the German battleship Tirpitz. Churchill wanted it destroyed at all costs, and there had been attempts to find the Tirpitz for some 15 months prior to my story tonight. It had been either disrupting or destroying convoys of munitions and supplies, notably to Soviet Russia, through the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. So Churchill ordered that this be found and destroyed. So that was the mission. There's the Tirpitz, there's Churchill. Now that is if you like, a picture representation of what the mission would look like. And as you can see, it's not very high level. On this particular occasion, the Spitfire was required to go low because Norwegian intelligence was such that the Tirpitz at the moment was very highly camouflaged. So the Spitfire had to go in quite low. This Spitfire also needed a very, very special pilot. Now, all the PRU pilots were especially gifted aviators, but Sandy was special. Sandy was 20 years old when he joined the Royal Air Force in 1940. He became pilot officer pretty quickly, and he was a Perthshire boy, born of, his father was a surgeon, and he was very good at school and a tremendous athlete. And his particular skills, based on about 15 months with the British Coast Guard, were in navigation, and that was crucial. You see, his job was to fly his Spitfire from RAF Wick in Scotland to an area just north of Trondheim in northern Norway, where it was thought the Tirpitz was currently lying. Round trip, about 1,500 miles. And it had not, and it's something like 500 PRU Spitfires were built throughout the whole of this period. And I only read recently that more than half of those Spitfires are at the bottom of the North Sea. Simply since the pilots were either died of their injuries while they were shot down maybe over Norway, couldn't find their way home, or they just got lost or ran out of fuel. And some 113 previous missions that Sandy was just about to undertake had been tried and failed to properly monitor and find the Tirpitz. This was a very dangerous mission indeed. And so it was, just after breakfast time of spring morning 1942, Sandy's mechanic would have taken him out to the Spitfire cockpit, help him get strapped in, get him all sorted out. That's his cockpit for the next 5 or 6 hours. In the cockpit, that's a Spitfire cockpit, obviously, all the basic flying controls you'd expect to see. In addition, most of the instruments that tell him the state of his aircraft, and also a compass that tells him where north is. That's it. That's runway 1331 at Wick, and this is the Air Traffic Control Centre, where Sandy would have spent at least the previous week studying meteorological charts and navigational maps to make sure he understood and remembered every single thing he was reading and being told. Why would he have to remember everything? Well, you see that door just here that opens and closes to let the pilot in. That is where Spitfire pilots would normally put their maps and their documentation. Not if you're a PRU pilot. You weren't allowed to take any documentation at all, because it was considered that if you were caught over enemy territory, the enemy might ascertain what it was you were trying to do, where you were from, etc., etc. So Sandy had to remember every single mile of those 1,400 miles he was just about to do. So just after 8 o'clock, Thursday the 5th of March, 42, Sandy took off. He probably left a note for his loved ones. He would have been wondering if that was his last cup of tea, his last breakfast, his last cigarette. Got into the cockpit anyway. They say that war is hardest on the infantryman, but you see, around about this time in aviation history, a new form of combat had emerged, which allowed for the possibility of immediate death almost as soon as the pilot got into the cockpit. Sandy knew this, but he did it anyway. Why? Well, I think it has to do with courage, expertise, experience, and a sense of duty. So here we are then. So Sandy would have circled over Wick until he reached about 15,000, 20,000 feet before making good his traverse across the North Sea. Now, I reckon that he would have set a course of roughly 052. So what does that mean? Well, north is 0, east is 90, south is 180, etc., etc., etc. He would have set a course for 052. So in his Spitfire cockpit, his compass would tell him where north is, and so he'd literally have to point until the compass heading says 052, and then proceed. Now, you might think that's all he had to do, just sit back, have his sandwiches. But here's the thing. If he's on a heading of 052, he's heading for this lady here, okay? You're where the Tirpitz was last seen. But if I've got a strong wind on the nose, I'm going to wonder when the hell I'm going to get to you, because I keep getting pushed back. It's hard to gauge. Similarly, if I've got a strong tailwind, I might overfly you before I've realised. In my limited experience as a pilot, the problem is a wind coming from left or right. So, for example, I'm on 052 and I've got a 40 mile an hour wind coming from my port side. That means all of a sudden 052 is this gentleman over here. And you could be Sweden, and we wouldn't want that. So you can see the difficulty. I don't know how he did it. But he did. He made good his transit across the North Sea, outside temperature at 30-odd thousand feet, probably minus 60 centigrade, something like that. Until finally he got to roughly where he thought the Tirpitz was last seen. This is a point where he would need to drop altitude and get down to some sort of usable height, probably about 1,000, maybe 1,500 feet. Now, in this diagram, you remember I said how low the Spitfire had to be flown on this particular mission. What is the problem if you've got an unarmed aircraft and you're at low altitude over enemy territory? You're going to get intercepted. That's right, and that's exactly what happened. 2 Me-109 combat aircraft from the Luftwaffe engaged Sandy's aircraft. They put something like 250 bullet rounds into his airframe, and 4 or 5 of those hit the engine block, and explosive cannon from those Messerschmitts took off most of his port wing, and the aircraft crashed into the Norwegian hillside. Fortunately, not before Sandy was able to bail out. Quite bad burns on his face and his legs. Other than that, he was okay. So that's where he was. He had no idea where he was, but fortunately, he was rescued by the Norwegian resistance. And they looked after him for 24 hours and advised him that if he was able to make the trip about 105 miles directly east into the relative sanctuary of what was then neutral Sweden, he would be able to escape through Sweden and back to the UK. The trouble was, the snow was very deep, the terrain was incredibly rugged and still is, and he decided to surrender to the German guards that were at in the local village where not far from where he was being looked after. So he gave himself up to the German soldiers. They then flew him to Frankfurt, where he was submitted to 4 weeks of close interrogation by the Gestapo. God only knows what that was like. Finally, when they'd finished with him, they shipped him off to a prisoner of war camp in Sargen, in what is now Poland. This is a photograph of Sandy with some of his colleagues taken not long after they got there. That's Sandy at the back there. This wasn't any old prisoner of war camp. This was state-of-the-art, relatively new, built to contain 20,000 prisoners of war, considered to be impossible to escape from. It was Hitler's pride and joy. That prisoner of war camp was Stalag Luft 3. And that's where Sandy spent the next 2 pretty miserable years of his life. But they were industrious years. You see, in that time, he and his colleagues were building 3 underground escape tunnels. They were called Tom, Dick, and Harry. Why 3? Well, for backup and redundancy, basically. And as it turned out, it was Harry that was the remaining tunnel that was going to be good enough for an escape on Friday, the 24th to 25th of March, 1944. If any of this is ringing a bell with you, then yes, this actually is the true event that was immortalised 19 years later by that movie, The Great Escape. It was planned that 220 prisoners of war would escape that night. As it turned out, 76 escaped before the tunnel was discovered, shut down, the balloon went up, and it all went very pear-shaped. Over the next 2 or 3 days, 75 of those prisoners were recaptured. Sandy actually escaped, but was found within an hour and a half. They were all brought back to Stalag Luft 3. Hitler was furious and ordered that they all be shot by the Gestapo without further notice. But Hitler's right-hand man was a chap called Hermann Göring, who was head of the Luftwaffe at the time and had the close ear to Hitler, and said to Hitler that this may not be a very good PR move, considering how many German prisoners of war were currently being held on Allied territory. So instead then, Hitler decided to only execute 50. Of those 50, 12 were Spitfire pilots, and of those 12, one was Sandy. He was 24 years old. Now, there are hundreds of stories like this, just from the Second World War on both sides, amongst men, women, English, German, and I will never get a chance to tell them all. But tonight, I'm telling this one for Sandy. His remains are currently lay in a Commonwealth war grave in Poznan, in Poland. Okay, so what happened to the Tirpitz? Well, the Tirpitz was located about 3 or 4 more PRU missions later, towards November 1944, when it was located. Number 617 Squadron, consisting of Avro Lancasters, that was the Dambuster Squadron, found the Tirpitz and dropped just under 600,000 pounds of munitions on the Tirpitz or around it. And it's said that about 24 hours after that raid, it finally listed and sank. What about the Spitfire though? What about our mystery? Well, this is the only known photograph of Sandy's machine, taken some 3 or 4 weeks before his ill-fated mission. And what made people wonder was, where the hell was it? Because everybody knew it was up there somewhere, but exactly where? And it wasn't for 76 years before, literally 6 years ago, in 2018, This organisation, Spitfire 88810, which was the registration on Sandy's aircraft, found the remains in Norway. There were quite a lot of big bits left because he was shot down at low level, as we've discussed, and also he pancaked into the mountainside at 20 degrees. So there was a fair bit of it left and in a reasonably containable area. Anyway, this organisation are putting it together and hope to build a replica to Sandy's memory. So that is the mystery of the Norwegian Spitfire solved. But just before I finish, I would just like the Spitfire itself to say hello to you all and then say goodbye.
Thank you.
It's rolling now.
It's rolling.
You tell me when to start. Speaking.
Okay. Do it.
Speaking?
Yep.
On the 5th of March 1936, the Spitfire prototype K5054 made its first ever flight from the Supermarine Works at Easton in southern England, heralding the start of a legend that is just as powerful today as it was during those dark years of World War II. Fuck me! Fuck me!
Stop. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much.
Is that, yeah. Alan Jackson, wasn't that fabulous? What a story.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.